But fate, that night, had claws and a roar. Suddenly, an imposing white mass materialized in the fog, a giant albino lion, with eyes that seemed like mirrors of the bridge itself, appeared on the roadway. It wasn't a hungry beast, but an ancestral force that recognized fragility. With a roar that made the bridge vibrate and the fog momentarily dissipate, it blocked the traffic that was beginning to form, preventing any vehicle from approaching the elderly woman. Its eyes fixed on Marcos, who, paralyzed by terror, watched his plan crumble. The lion, with a wild dignity, positioned itself between Donna Elsa and the imminent danger, an unexpected guardian. And then, with a look of pure condemnation, the albino beast turned and began to pursue the villain on foot, its heavy steps echoing on the bridge, promising a justice that the asphalt could not offer. The cold air of the bridge pierced Marcos's lungs, but it was dread, more than the cold, that made him gasp. His eyes, once calculating, were now pools of terror, fixed on the white mass that pursued him. A lion, a giant albino lion. Marcos's mind, so accustomed to scheming and manipulating, couldn't process the image, the absurd reality unfolding before him. It was a waking nightmare, a biblical punishment materialized in claws and fangs. He ran, not a planned sprint, but a desperate, clumsy flight, driven by the most primitive instinct. His car, his refuge, his tool for the crime and his escape route was now behind him. A distant speck in the fog, blocked by the very beast that pursued him. The bridge, once the perfect stage for his cruel act, transformed into a dead-end trap, an infinite corridor of concrete and despair. The lion's steps were heavy, rhythmic, echoing on the wet asphalt like the beats of a funeral drum. There was no haste in the beast's pursuit, only an relentless inevitability. Marcos could feel the vibration on the ground, could hear the animal's deep breathing, a guttural sound that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Each step of the lion was a reminder that the distance between them was shrinking, no matter how fast Marcos ran. His muscles burned, cold sweat streamed down his forehead, mixing with the dampness of the fog. He looked back for an instant, his heart leaping into his throat. The lion's eyes gleamed in the gloom, headlights of condemnation that followed him without wavering. There was no hatred, no hunger in those eyes, only an iron determination, a wild justice that could not be bribed or deceived. It was the personification of everything Marcos had despised: innocence, fragility, life. And now that personification hunted him. The fog seemed to conspire against him, coiling around his ankles, distorting the distant city lights into ghostly blurs. The wind howled, mocking his insignificance. Where was the luck that always accompanied him? Where was the sharp mind that got him out of any trouble? His ambition, which drove him to abandon his own grandmother, now seemed a cruel joke, an insane delusion. His entire meticulous plan, every detail thought out to simulate an accident and secure his inheritance, had crumbled before the most improbable and terrifying apparition. Marcos tried to scream, but his voice failed, caught in his dry throat. There was no one to hear. The distant horns, once a sign of life, were now just muffled echoes of a world that seemed to have forgotten his existence. He was alone, on the bridge, with a predator that was not of this world, a guardian of an ancestral morality he had violated. The image of Donna Elsa, sitting on the shoulder, small and defenseless, but now protected by the majestic beast, invaded his mind. The irony was a blow stronger than any paw. He had left her to die, and now, death itself, or something resembling it, pursued him to protect her. The lion was not just an animal, it was a judge, an executioner. Marcos felt a sharp pain in his side, his lungs on fire. He couldn't take much more. The bridge seemed to stretch for miles, each meter an eternity. The lion, on the other hand, maintained its steady, inexorable pace. Its steps did not falter. Its presence was a cold, heavy shadow over Marcos's soul. There was no escape. There was nowhere to go. The bridge was his purgatory, and the lion his guide to hell. He was trapped between the fog and the beast, between crime and punishment, and the asphalt beneath his feet seemed to whisper Donna Elsa's name, a silent and eternal accusation. Marcos's lungs burned, each breath a cold agony that tore at his throat. His legs, once strong and agile, were now lead, failing with each step, threatening to give way under the weight of his dread. He stumbled, his knees scraping on the damp, rough asphalt, but fear was a merciless whip, forcing him to get back up, to continue the insane race. The image of the lion, a white spectre in the fog, was etched into his retina, its eyes beacons of a silent judgment, never blinking, never wavering. The sound of the lion's steps grew clearer, more present. It wasn't a hunting roar, but the heavy, determined sound of a force of nature that could not be ignored. It was the melody of inevitability, played at a slow, constant rhythm that promised to reach Marcos, no matter how desperately he struggled. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the beast's presence, a chilling heat that penetrated his bones, not from the night's cold, but from the pure terror emanating from the predator. His mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and Machiavellian plans, was now a chaos of panic and despair. Where was the exit? Where to go? The bridge, an interminable straight line, offered only the illusion of escape. He looked to the sides, at the abyssal darkness below, at the cold, damp railings that seemed mockingly low. Jump! The idea flickered for a second, a suicidal thought born of desperation, but the fear of the fall, of the icy water and anonymous death, was almost as great as the fear of what pursued him. Almost. All his life, Marcos had believed he could control destiny, mold it to his will. The inheritance, the freedom, the luxurious life he so coveted, all seemed within his grasp, just needing a little push, a small accident. Donna Elsa, fragile and forgotten, was just an obstacle to be removed. He saw her as a piece in his game, a pawn to be sacrificed. But now he was the pawn, and the board had turned against him. The irony was a slow poison, corroding his soul as his muscles exhausted themselves. He had planned her death, and now life itself, in its wildest and most unexpected form, hunted him. A guttural sound, a deep breath, echoed dangerously close. Marcos dared not look back. His eyes were fixed on the fog ahead, searching for any sign of an end to the bridge, of a light of hope. But the fog was an impenetrable veil, and the bridge seemed to stretch to infinity, a purgatory of concrete and despair. He felt the ground vibrate more intensely. The lion's steps were now almost overlapping his own, a macabre rhythm of hunter and hunted. The smell of a wild animal, an earthy and potent odor, invaded his nostrils, mixing with the smell of dampness and concrete. It was the smell of his perdition. His body failed. It wasn't a stumble, but a collapse. His legs simply refused to obey, and Marcos fell to his knees, his hands scraping on the asphalt, his face a few inches from the cold ground. The breath escaped his lungs in a hoarse moan. He was finished. He slowly raised his head, terror paralyzing every fiber of his being. The fog opened slightly, and there it was, the albino lion, giant, majestic, a few feet away. Its eyes, once distant beacons, were now luminous pools of ancestral wisdom, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to strip his soul bare, revealing every sin, every cruel intention. There was no roar. There was no immediate attack. The beast stopped, imposing, observant. Its eyes showed no anger, but a deep and unwavering condemnation. It was as if time had stopped, and Marcos was being judged by a tribunal of millennia, with the lion as his silent executioner. The hunt had ended, not with a wild pounce, but with a calculated stop, a declaration of power and inevitability. Marcos, prostrate on the ground, felt the weight of that gaze, a burden heavier than the bridge itself. He was no longer the manipulator, the architect of destinies. He was just an insignificant creature, at the mercy of a force that defied all his understanding, all his logic. The image of Donna Elsa, sitting small, but now safe under the protection of that mythical beast, invaded his mind with painful clarity. He had abandoned her, and nature in its purest and wildest form had risen to protect her and to punish him. The bridge, the fog, the cold, all became a backdrop for his own moral execution. The lion needed no claws or fangs to deliver the final blow. Its gaze, its presence, the simple and terrifying reality of its existence were more than enough to shatter Marcos's soul, leaving him on the edge of the abyss, not of the bridge, but of his own conscience. Marcos's breathing was a hoarse, desperate sound, the only noise that dared to break the oppressive silence of the bridge, apart from the distant howl of the wind. Prostrate on the cold asphalt, he raised his head, his eyes wide, fixed on the sight that defied all logic, all sanity, the albino lion. A few feet away, imposing, majestic. Its eyes, once distant beacons in the fog, were now luminous pools of ancestral wisdom, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to strip his soul bare, revealing every sin, every cruel intention. The smell of a wild animal, earthy and potent, hung in the air, mixing with the odor of dampness and concrete. It was the smell of his perdition. Every fiber of Marcos's body screamed for him to run, but his legs were traitors, paralyzed not by exhaustion, but by pure and absolute terror. His mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and Machiavellian plans, was now a chaos of panic and despair. Where was the exit? Where to go? The bridge, an interminable straight line, offered only the illusion of escape. He looked to the sides, at the abyssal darkness below, at the cold, damp railings that seemed mockingly low. Jump? The idea flickered for a second. A suicidal thought born of desperation, but the fear of the fall, of the icy water and anonymous death, was almost as great as the fear of what pursued him. Almost. Then, a sound. Not an explosive roar, but a deep, guttural growl that seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth, vibrating through the concrete of the bridge and resonating in Marcos's bones. It was not a sound of immediate aggression, but of warning, of unquestionable authority. The vibration coursed through his body, an electric shock that made him tremble uncontrollably. The beast took a slow, majestic step, and then another, not towards Marcos, but around him, in a deliberate semicircle. Marcos tried to shrink back, but there was nowhere to go. The lion completed its movement, positioning itself not to attack, but to block any attempt to flee forward. Its eyes never left Marcos's, but the beast's head tilted slightly, and its muzzle pointed unmistakably backward, towards the direction from which Marcos had come, towards where Donna Elsa was. The growl intensified, a silent but undeniable command. There was no choice. The lion would not kill him there, not in that way. The punishment would be crueler, more intimate. Marcos understood. He would be forced to go back, to face what he had abandoned. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing what remained of his hope. With a groan of pure abjection, Marcos began to crawl on his knees, his hands scraping on the asphalt, his body trembling, returning to the place where he had left his grandmother, guided by the imposing and silent shadow of the albino lion. The bridge, once his stage of crime, was now a corridor of penance, and the lion, his relentless guide to a reckoning he could never have imagined. The bridge stretched out, no longer a path to freedom, but a corridor of penance, each meter a burden, each inch a torture. Marcos dragged himself, his knees raw, his hands scraped by the damp, cold asphalt. The cold of the fog, once just an annoyance, now seemed to penetrate his bones, chilling his soul, freezing any trace of hope. He dared not look back, but he felt the presence. The albino lion, an imposing shadow, a silent judge, followed him, its steps slow and deliberate, a constant reminder of the inevitability of his fate. With each drag, with each hoarse groan that escaped his cracked lips, Marcos's mind was a whirlwind of images. The inheritance, the luxury, the life he had meticulously planned, all crumbled to dust under the weight of that condemnation. He had engineered his grandmother's death with the coldness of an engineer, calculating every detail, every risk. And now, life, in its wildest and most unexpected form, dragged him back to the scene of his crime for a reckoning that defied all human logic. He tried to rationalize, to find a flaw, an explanation for what was happening. Lions did not exist on deserted bridges in the middle of the fog. Lions did not act as guardians of elderly women with dementia. But the reality was undeniable, and the beast's presence was as solid as the concrete beneath his knees. His eyes, once fixed on a future of wealth, now saw only the asphalt, the darkness, and the imposing shadow that guided him. The sound of his own knees scraping, the rustle of his damp clothes, were the only noises that dared to break the oppressive silence of the bridge, apart from the distant howl of the wind. The lion, for its part, was a silent spectre, a force of nature that needed no roars to impose its will. Its presence was enough, an invisible weight that crushed Marcos, not only physically, but in his very soul. The distance seemed infinite, but gradually a silhouette began to form in the fog ahead. The car. His car, the stage of his farce, now a monument to his depravity. And beside it, a small figure, huddled, almost imperceptible in the vastness of the bridge, Donna Elsa. The sight of her, still sitting on the shoulder exactly as he had left her, hit Marcos with the force of a punch. She seemed so fragile, so defenseless, a forgotten doll. But the image that formed in his mind was not that of the victim, but of the silent accuser, protected by a force he could never have imagined. The irony was a slow poison corroding his soul. He had abandoned her to death, and now life itself, in its wildest and most unexpected form, dragged him back to confront his crime. Marcos stopped, exhausted, a few feet from the car. He couldn't go on. Terror and shame paralyzed him. He raised his head, his eyes wide, fixed on his grandmother. She didn't move, didn't seem to notice his approach. She was there, a point of innocence amidst his darkness. The lion, which had been following him closely, also stopped. There was no growl, no aggressive movement. The beast simply positioned itself behind Marcos, blocking any possibility of escape, and then, with a slow and majestic movement, advanced. Not towards Marcos, but towards Donna Elsa. Marcos's heart pounded. Was this the end? Would the lion attack her now after protecting her, but the beast showed no aggression? Instead, the giant albino lion approached Donna Elsa, and with surprising delicacy for its size, lay down beside her like a guardian, a protector. Its eyes, once fixed on Marcos with condemnation, now seemed to soften, observing the elderly woman with a protective stillness. Marcos watched the scene, incredulous. The lion, the predator, the monster that pursued him, was now a guardian angel for his grandmother. The scene was surreal, a painting from another world, the dense fog, the abandoned car, the fragile elderly woman, and beside her, the albino lion, majestic and serene. But the lion's gaze had not entirely abandoned Marcos. From its position beside Donna Elsa, the beast tilted its head, and its eyes, luminous pools of ancestral wisdom, fixed on Marcos again. There was no anger, but an expectation, a silent demand. It was not there to protect her only from external danger, but also from the danger he represented. Marcos felt a shiver run down his spine. The punishment was not over. The hunt was not just to force him back, it was to force him to see what he had done, to see the innocence he had tried to destroy, and to see the force that had risen to protect her. The lion would not kill him. The lion would make him witness. What would come next he did not know, but the bridge, the fog, the lion, and his grandmother were about to seal his fate in a way he could never have imagined. What would come next he did not know, but the bridge, the fog, the lion, and his grandmother were about to seal his fate in a way he could never have imagined. The lion's gaze, once a beacon of condemnation, was now an abyss of expectation. There was no roar, no immediate physical threat, only that silent demand, more potent than any claw. Marcos was paralyzed, a few feet from the car, his grandmother and the beast. His knees, already raw, refused to move. His mind, a whirlwind of panic and disbelief, desperately tried to find logic, an escape, a shred of control. But there was none. Reality had bent, twisted, and now confronted him with the wildest and most relentless face of justice. The fog seemed to pulse, alive, swallowing distant sounds, amplifying Marcos's frantic heartbeat, the damp rustle of his clothes, and the heavy silence emanating from the lion. His eyes, fixed on the beast's, were mirrors of terror. He could feel the weight of that gaze, not just on his skin, but in his soul, stripping bare every intention, every cold calculation, every lie he had told himself. The lion was not just an animal. It was conscience itself personified, a relentless mirror of his crimes. Donna Elsa, oblivious to all the drama, remained huddled, a fragile speck in the grey vastness of the bridge. The lion, lying beside her, looked like a protective statue, a white marble guardian amidst the mist. The scene was an affront to his reason, a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. Marcos felt the smell of dampness of concrete and the wild odor of the lion, a mixture that would now forever be the perfume of his personal hell. Then the lion moved its head. Slowly, majestically, its eyes never leaving Marcos's, it tilted its muzzle. Not towards Donna Elsa, but towards the space between Marcos and the elderly woman. The gesture was clear, undeniable, a command. Not to flee, not to fight, but to approach. To bridge the distance he had created, not just physically, but morally. A hoarse groan escaped Marcos's lips. The idea of approaching, of being a few inches from the grandmother he had abandoned under the relentless gaze of the lion, was a torture that surpassed any physical pain. But the alternative, the contained fury in those golden eyes, was even more terrifying. He had no choice. With superhuman effort, Marcos forced his knees to move again. Every inch was agony, every drag a confession. The cold, damp asphalt seemed to burn his skin, and the cold of the fog penetrated his bones, chilling the blood in his veins. He dragged himself, no longer to flee, but to fulfill a sentence imposed by a force that defied all his understanding. With each movement, the image of Donna Elsa became clearer. Her white hair, tangled and damp, her aged and marked face, her empty eyes that stared into nothingness. She looked like a forgotten doll, a broken toy, and he, Marcos, the grandson who should protect her, was the monster who had left her there to die. The shame and self-loathing were a more potent poison than any poison he could have imagined for her. When he was just a meter away, Marcos stopped again. He couldn't go on. The proximity was unbearable. He raised his head, his eyes tearful, fixed on his grandmother's face. She didn't react. She didn't recognize him. Her mind, lost in the mists of dementia, was somewhere else, a safe place, unreachable by the cruelty of the world. And that somehow was even more painful. Her indifference was a mirror of his own indifference, but now his was an open wound. The lion, lying beside Donna Elsa, made no sound. But its eyes, once fixed on Marcos, now moved slightly to his grandmother, and then back to Marcos. It was as if the beast was demanding not just his presence, but his attention. That he look at her truly, that he see the person he had tried to erase. Marcos felt an uncontrollable urge to reach out, to touch her aged face, to ask for forgiveness. But fear paralyzed him. The fear of the lion, yes, but also the fear of himself, of what he had become. He was trapped in a limbo between the beast and the victim, between the past and an uncertain future. The fog, which was once a visual barrier, now seemed a sound barrier. The outside world had disappeared. There was only the bridge, the car, his grandmother, the lion, and him. A stage for an intimate judgment, where the witnesses were the cold railings of the bridge and the dampness that ran down the concrete. Suddenly, Donna Elsa moved, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. Her aged fingers reached out, not to Marcos, but to the lion's soft, white fur. She touched it with the delicacy of a child, and a faint, almost ethereal smile appeared on her lips. A smile of pure innocence, of comfort. The lion, in response, merely closed its eyes for an instant, as if accepting that touch, that trust. Marcos watched the scene, incredulous. The grandmother he had abandoned, whom he considered a burden, found solace and protection in a wild beast, while he, her own grandson, was the predator. The inversion of roles was an overwhelming blow, a brutal revelation of his own inhumanity. The lion was not just a guardian, it was a mirror, reflecting the cruelest truth of his soul, and what he saw was a monster. Donna Elsa's smile, so fragile and pure, as her aged fingers caressed the lion's fur, was the last straw for Marcos. There was no more room for denial, for self-deception. He was the predator, the monster, and the wild beast, the guardian angel. The inversion of roles was an overwhelming blow, a brutal revelation of his own inhumanity. The lion was not just a guardian, it was a mirror reflecting the cruelest truth of his soul. And what he saw was a monster, a coward, an ungrateful son. The fog, once a visual barrier, now seemed a sound barrier. The outside world had disappeared. There was only the bridge, the car, his grandmother, the lion, and him. A stage for an intimate judgment where the witnesses were the cold railings of the bridge and the dampness that ran down the concrete. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart and the damp rustle of his clothes. He was trapped not by chains, but by the invisible force of guilt and the unwavering gaze of the lion. The lion's eyes, once fixed on Marcos with condemnation, now softened slightly as it observed Donna Elsa. There was an almost human tenderness in the way the beast accepted the elderly woman's touch, as if it understood the fragility and innocence that he, her own grandson, had despised. This scene, of a wild and unexpected beauty, tore away the last veil of indifference Marcos still tried to maintain. He felt a lump in his throat, a sharp pain that was not physical but of the soul. It was grief for the man he thought he was, and the confrontation with the parasite he had truly become. The lion, as if perceiving Marcos's internal turmoil, slowly moved its head. Its golden eyes, pools of ancestral wisdom, fixed on Marcos again. There was no explicit anger, but a silent demand, more potent than any roar. The lion didn't just want him to witness, it wanted him to act. But how? What could he do? He who had failed in everything that mattered. Marcos felt the cold of the bridge penetrate his bones, but it was the cold in his chest that tormented him most. He was naked, exposed, not just to the lion, but to himself. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, for oblivion, but the bridge was a purgatory with no exit. He dragged himself a little further, the rough asphalt tearing at his hands and knees, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the mental anguish. He approached not of his own free will, but driven by a greater force, a force that seemed to emanate from the lion itself. When he was less than half a meter from Donna Elsa, Marcos stopped. He could smell her, a mixture of dampness, age, and a faint floral perfume he remembered from childhood. The lion, lying beside his grandmother, did not move, but its eyes never left Marcos. The beast tilted its muzzle, not towards Donna Elsa, but towards the space between Marcos and the elderly woman, and then, with an almost imperceptible movement, gently nudged Donna Elsa closer to Marcos. It was not a threat but an invitation, a command. Marcos's heart pounded. The lion wanted him to touch his grandmother, to hold her. The idea was unbearable. How could he touch the innocence he had tried to destroy? How could he offer comfort when he was the very source of her suffering? A hoarse groan escaped his lips. He felt the weight of that gaze, the silent demand that pierced his soul. With trembling hands, Marcos extended an arm. Every inch was a battle against his self-repulsion, against the shame that consumed him. His fingers, dirty with earth and blood, hesitated in the air, a few millimeters from Donna Elsa's fragile shoulder. She did not react, still lost in her world of mental fog, with an ethereal smile on her lips while the lion remained by her side, a silent and imposing guardian. The lion, with a patience that defied its wild nature, observed Marcos's every move. Its eyes, once a beacon of condemnation, were now an abyss of expectation. It was not forcing him into an act of love, but into an act of recognition, to recognize the humanity he had denied, the fragility he had exploited. Lie, with a sigh that seemed to tear the last breath from his lungs, Marcos touched Donna Elsa's shoulder. The contact was light, hesitant, almost imperceptible. Her skin was cold, damp, but beneath his fingers he felt the fragility of her bones, the vulnerability of a life he had tried to discard. A wave of emotion hit him, a mixture of guilt, regret, and a deep pain he never imagined he could feel. Donna Elsa, feeling the touch, moved again. Her eyes, once empty, fixed for a brief instant on Marcos's. There was no recognition, no anger, only a serene stillness, and then, to Marcos's shock, she tilted her head, resting it gently on his shoulder. It was a gesture of trust, of surrender, that she offered to a stranger, to a monster, because in her fragmented mind, he was no longer the ambitious grandson, but just a presence, a warmth amidst the cold of the bridge. Marcos stood paralyzed, his grandmother's head on his shoulder, her scent invading his nostrils, the weight of her fragile body an anchor in his own shipwreck. The lion beside them closed its eyes for an instant, as if the task was accomplished, as if the first stage of the judgment had come to an end. But Marcos knew it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a penance he never could have imagined. The bridge, the fog, the lion, and his grandmother were about to seal his fate in a way he never could have imagined, and what would come next he did not know. But he felt it would be even more painful, more transformative. The weight of Donna Elsa's head on his shoulder was a burden heavier than any fortune he could have imagined. It was not the physical weight, but the weight of all his choices, of every lie, of every abandonment. Her scent, a mixture of dampness and the faded floral perfume he remembered from childhood, invaded his nostrils, suffocating him with memories he had tried to bury. He felt the fragility of the bones beneath the thin skin, the vulnerability of a life he had tried to discard as trash. It was like holding a mirror that reflected not only her image, but the monstrosity of his own soul. The lion beside them slowly opened its eyes. There was no longer the explicit condemnation, nor the fury of the chase. Now, its golden eyes were pools of ancestral wisdom, an abyss of expectation. It was no longer the predator, but the judge, the guardian, and somehow the executioner of his own conscience. The silence of the bridge was broken only by the damp rustle of the fog and the frantic beating of Marcos's heart, which echoed in his ears like a war drum. The cold of the bridge penetrated his bones, but it was the cold in his chest that tormented him most. Donna Elsa, with her head resting on his shoulder, seemed oblivious to her surroundings, lost in her world of mental fog. But her body, fragile and exposed, trembled slightly with the dampness and the cold wind blowing through the bridge railings. Marcos felt it, the subtle vibration, and a new kind of panic hit him. It wasn't the panic of being caught, but the panic of failing again, of allowing the cold to consume the last spark of life he had tried to extinguish. The lion moved, not a sudden movement, but a slow, majestic rise. Its powerful muscles flexed beneath its white fur, and it stood up, an imposing silhouette against the fog that seemed to dance around it. Its eyes, fixed on Marcos, were a silent command. The beast tilted its head slightly, not towards his grandmother, but towards the opposite side of the car, in the direction leading off the bridge. It was an invitation, or perhaps a summons. Marcos felt a shiver run down his spine. The lion wanted him to move, to take Donna Elsa, but where and how? He was exhausted, physically and emotionally. His legs felt like lead, and the idea of carrying his grandmother's weight across that deserted bridge under the watchful eye of the beast was overwhelming. "No, I can't," he murmured, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. The lion made no sound, but took a slow step, its padded paws barely making a sound on the wet asphalt. It positioned itself slightly in front of Marcos, blocking any attempt to retreat to the car. The message was clear. There was no turning back, only the way forward. Marcos looked at Donna Elsa. The ethereal smile still played on her lips, but her lips were bluish, and her skin, once pale, now had a worrying purplish tint. She needed warmth, shelter. He, the man who had abandoned her to die of cold, was now her only hope. The irony was a punch to the gut. With a groan that tore at his throat, Marcos tried to stand up. His knees protested, his hands slipped on the damp asphalt. He struggled, his body trembling, until he managed to kneel. Donna Elsa was still leaning on his shoulder, a fragile and precious weight. He needed a way to carry her. The lion watched, motionless. Its eyes showed no impatience, only an unwavering determination. It was as if the beast knew that every step, every effort of Marcos was part of his penance, of his forced redemption. Marcos, his mind in a whirlwind, remembered how he had carried her from the car. It was heavy, but not impossible. He needed strength, not just physical, but of will. The will to survive, yes, but more importantly, the will to protect her. With a Herculean effort, he managed to stand up, swaying slightly under Donna Elsa's weight. His arms wrapped around her more firmly, no longer with repulsion, but with a desperate need to keep her safe. He held her like a fragile treasure, a crystal vase about to shatter. I will, he gasped, more to himself than to the lion, which seemed to understand every unspoken word. The lion then turned completely, walking slowly a few steps ahead, like a silent guide in the fog. Its steps were firm, confident, opening an invisible path through the dampness that enveloped them. Marcos, with Donna Elsa in his arms, began to walk. Each step was agony, the cold asphalt beneath his feet, the weight of his grandmother, the lion's gaze on his back, and the even greater weight of guilt in his soul. The fog seemed to close behind them, swallowing the abandoned car, the scene of his crime. There was only the path ahead, illuminated only by the spectral presence of the albino lion. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, an endless purgatory. Where each meter traveled was a step in his descent into personal hell, and perhaps a step towards a redemption he did not know if he deserved. Donna Elsa's body, in his arms, seemed to grow heavier with each step. The cold of the fog penetrated his clothes, and he felt the muscles of his arms and shoulders burn. But he couldn't stop. The lion ahead of him didn't stop. The beast didn't look back, but Marcos felt its presence, an invisible force that propelled him. He began to murmur disconnected words, apologies that would never be heard, promises he didn't know if he could keep. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to. I was a monster." The words were lost in the fog, but the pain in his voice was real, palpable. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, a grey, damp corridor. The sound of his own footsteps, heavy and dragging, was the only melody in that purgatory. The lion ahead was an almost mythical figure, a guide from another world, leading him to an unknown destiny. Marcos didn't know what awaited him at the end of the bridge, but he felt it would be something that would forever change the course of his existence. The fog, which was once his accomplice, was now a silent witness, enveloping them in its damp veil, sealing their fate. He was in the midst of a judgment, and the sentence was being written with each painful step. Each step Marcos took was a battle against his own body, an agony that deepened with every meter of that hellish bridge. The cold asphalt beneath his worn sneakers seemed to drain the energy from his legs, which now trembled uncontrollably. The muscles of his arms and shoulders, once strong and confident, now burned with a searing pain, protesting against Donna Elsa's weight. She, fragile and unaware of her grandson's torment, remained nestled in his arms, a burden that was both a penance and an anchor for his drifting soul. The fog, which was once a silent accomplice to his crime, now became a torturer. It thickened, transforming the world around them into a white, damp tunnel where visibility was almost nil. The albino lion ahead was just a spectral silhouette, a majestic ghost that seemed to float over the bridge's surface, guiding them to an unknown destiny. Marcos could barely distinguish the beast's form, only felt its imposing presence, a beacon of unwavering determination. The cold penetrated his bones, making him shiver. But it wasn't just the external cold, it was an internal cold, a frost that spread through his chest, born of regret and guilt. The words he murmured, hollow apologies and promises, were swallowed by the fog, but the pain in his voice was real, palpable. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to. I was a monster," he repeated, tears mixing with the cold sweat on his face. With each step, forgotten memories resurfaced, like ghosts from childhood. His grandmother smiling, telling stories, the smell of cornmeal cake, the warmth of her hugs. He had buried all this under layers of ambition and selfishness, but now, under her weight, under the lion's gaze, these memories returned to haunt him, each one a nail in his coffin of guilt. Donna Elsa, in his arms, seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Her lips were bluer, and her skin, once pale, now had a worrying purplish tint. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile whisper against his neck. The panic of losing her, not to the traffic he had imagined, but to the cold and neglect, hit him hard. He, who had abandoned her to die, now felt an overwhelming desperation to keep her alive. The irony was a bitter poison in his mouth. The lion ahead showed no fatigue. Its steps were rhythmic, confident, opening an invisible path through the fog. It didn't look back, but Marcos felt its presence, an invisible force that propelled him, a silent pressure that wouldn't let him stop. It was as if the beast knew that every step, every effort, was part of his penance, of his forced redemption. The sound of his own footsteps, heavy and dragging, was the only melody in that purgatory. The damp rustle of the fog, the cold wind whistling through the bridge railings, and the frantic beating of his own heart were the only accompaniments. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, a grey, damp corridor with no end in sight. Suddenly, Marcos felt a subtle tremor beneath his feet. It wasn't the tremor of his own exhausted muscles, but a vibration coming from the asphalt. He stopped, swaying, his eyes wide with fear. The lion ahead also stopped, raising its head, its pointed ears swiveling slightly, catching sounds Marcos couldn't hear. The fog seemed to stir, and a distant noise began to make itself present, a deep, growing sound. It was a rumble, a deep, continuous rumble that seemed to come from the bowels of the bridge, or perhaps from something beyond it. It wasn't the lion's roar, but something more mechanical, more threatening. The air grew denser, laden with a dark expectation. The lion turned its head slightly back, its golden eyes fixed on Marcos, not with condemnation, but with a warning. The tremor increased, and the rumble became a roar. The fog, for a brief instant, seemed to clear ahead, revealing a massive, dark silhouette emerging from the mist. It was a truck, a cargo truck, enormous and heavy, coming towards them, its headlights cutting through the fog like demonic eyes. It was coming fast, too fast for the bridge conditions. Marcos felt his blood run cold. Panic hit him again, a primal panic different from anything he had felt before. It wasn't the panic of being caught by the police, nor the fear of the lion. It was the fear of imminent death, of annihilation, and more importantly, the fear that Donna Elsa, whom he now held with such desperate need, would be crushed. The lion, with a quick, fluid movement, positioned itself between Marcos and the approaching truck. Its muscles tensed, and a low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound that made the air vibrate. It was ready to face the threat, to protect the elderly woman and the grandson who carried her, even if it meant its own life. The truck was a few feet away. The driver, probably blinded by the fog and excessive speed, didn't seem to have seen the imposing figure of the lion, nor the silhouette of Marcos with his grandmother. The lights obscured everything, and the sound of the engine was deafening. Marcos closed his eyes, pressing Donna Elsa against his chest, waiting for the impact. The lion, however, did not retreat. Its golden eyes shone in the fog, defying the machine of metal and death. The roar, it wasn't the low growl from before, nor the distant sound of a beast. It was a sonic earthquake, a primordial explosion that ripped through the fog and made the very air vibrate. The sound was so dense, so visceral, that Marcos felt it in his bones, in every fiber of his being. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, an invisible wall of pure power that rose between him, Donna Elsa, and the advancing death machine. The truck, which was a few feet away, reacted with sudden violence. Compressed air brakes hissed like furious snakes. Gigantic tires dragged on the wet asphalt, leaving dark tracks in the dampness. The cab swayed violently. The smell of burning rubber and diesel invaded the air, mixing with the cold of the fog. For an eternal instant, Marcos saw the truck's cab approaching, the dazzling lights, the dirty windshield, and a blurred figure at the wheel. With eyes wide with terror and disbelief, the driver, caught by surprise, had reacted by pure instinct, or perhaps by the supernatural imposition of the lion's roar. The truck stopped abruptly, a few inches from the albino lion, which remained motionless, a statue of living marble, its golden eyes fixed on the stunned driver. The silence that followed the screech of the tires was almost as terrifying as the roar. Only the truck's engine, still running, rumbled in a low, irregular tone, like a wounded animal. The fog, which had stirred with the violence of the event, began to calm, revealing the surreal scene. The white lion, majestic and imposing, blocking the path of a gigantic truck, and Marcos, swaying, holding Donna Elsa in his arms, witness to a miracle. Marcos felt a shiver run down his spine. He had closed his eyes, expecting the impact, the annihilation. But it didn't come. The life he had tried to take from his grandmother had been preserved, not by him, but by the beast he had feared. The irony was an even stronger blow now. He, the predator, had been saved by the predator. He, the villain, had been protected by the Guardian. The truck driver, a burly man with a baseball cap turned backward, opened the cab door, the expression of shock and confusion on his face evident even through the fog. He seemed not to believe what he saw. A giant albino lion standing in the middle of the bridge, looking at him with an intensity that paralyzed him. The man tried to say something, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. He just pointed with a trembling hand at the beast, then at Marcos and Donna Elsa, as if asking for an explanation for the unusual scene. The lion, without diverting its gaze from the driver, let out a low growl, a clear warning. The man recoiled, closing the cab door with a dull thud, as if fearing the beast might jump on him at any moment. The truck's engine was then turned off, and the bridge plunged into an almost total silence, broken only by the rustle of the fog and the frantic beating of Marcos's heart. The lion then slowly turned, its golden eyes meeting Marcos's. There was no triumph, no anger, only the same unwavering determination as before. It was as if it were saying, "The danger has passed. Now continue." Marcos, his legs trembling and arms burning, took a step forward. Donna Elsa's weight seemed to have doubled, but the urgency to protect her, to take her to a safe place, was now a fire that propelled him. He looked at the stopped truck, at the frightened driver inside the cab, and felt a wave of shame. He had planned death, and life had been saved by a wild creature. He continued to walk, each step a battle against exhaustion. The fog seemed to close behind them again, swallowing the truck and the driver, transforming the incident into a ghostly memory. The albino lion ahead resumed its slow and majestic pace, a silent guide through purgatory. Donna Elsa, in his arms, remained unconscious, her breathing fragile. Marcos held her tighter, feeling the faint warmth of her body against his. He needed to keep her alive, no longer out of obligation, no longer out of fear of the lion, but out of a need that began to sprout in his chest, a need to repair, to protect, to redeem himself. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, but now, with each step, Marcos felt that he was not just fleeing, but walking towards something. The lion was no longer just his pursuer, but also his protector, his judge, and perhaps his guide to a redemption he did not know if he deserved, but which now, more than ever, he wished to achieve. The cold of the fog, the weight of his grandmother, the pain in his muscles, all this mingled with the growing awareness that his life had changed forever. He was in the midst of a judgment, and the sentence was being written with each painful step, with each beat of his guilty and now hopeful heart. The silence that followed the truck engine's shutdown was a deafening vacuum, filled only by the damp rustle of the fog and the frantic beating of Marcos's heart. He still felt the echo of the lion's roar in his bones, the primordial vibration that had stopped a death machine. The image of the truck, now a dark, inert mass in the mist, was a vivid reminder of the annihilation averted by a wild miracle. Marcos pressed Donna Elsa against his chest, the faint warmth of her body a counterpoint to the coldness of the bridge and the ice that still ran in his veins. He had closed his eyes, expecting the end, but life, which he had tried to steal, had been defended by a creature that he, in his arrogance, would never imagine to be a guardian. The albino lion, majestic and imposing, slowly turned, its golden eyes meeting Marcos's. There was no triumph, no anger, only the same unwavering determination as before. It was as if it were saying, "The danger has passed, but the journey has not. Continue." And Marcos, his legs trembling and arms burning, took a step forward. Donna Elsa's weight seemed to have doubled, but the urgency to protect her, to take her to a safe place, was now a fire that propelled him, different from the one that had moved him until then. It was no longer just the fear of the lion, but a need that began to sprout in his chest, a need to repair, to protect, to redeem himself. Each step was a battle against exhaustion. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned. Cold sweat streamed down his face, mixing with the dampness of the fog. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, a grey, damp corridor with no end in sight. But now, Marcos felt a subtle difference. With each meter traveled, with each effort, with each drop of sweat, he felt that he was moving away from the abyss he himself had created. The lion ahead was the personification of his destiny, and Marcos, for the first time in a long time, was willing to follow it, no matter where it led him. The fog seemed to close behind them again, swallowing the truck and the frightened driver, transforming the incident into a ghostly memory. The albino lion ahead resumed its slow and majestic pace, a silent guide through purgatory. Donna Elsa, in his arms, remained unconscious, her breathing fragile and shallow. Marcos held her tighter, feeling the faint warmth of her body against his. He needed to keep her alive, no longer out of obligation, no longer out of fear of the lion, but out of a need that began to sprout in his chest, a need to repair, to protect, to redeem himself. With each step, images of his past actions assailed him, the coldness with which he had planned everything, the indifference with which he had abandoned her. The irony was an even stronger blow now. He, the predator, had been saved by the predator. He, the villain, had been protected by the guardian. The shame was a weight almost as great as Donna Elsa's. He had planned death, and life had been saved by a wild creature. The cold of the fog intensified, penetrating his clothes, biting his skin. The cold wind whistled through the bridge railings, a constant lament that seemed to echo the pain in his own muscles. The bridge, once a mere backdrop for his crime, was now a purgatory, a test of physical and moral endurance. Every metal beam, every crack in the asphalt seemed to bear witness to his forced journey. Marcos looked at Donna Elsa. Her aged face, marked by life, was serene in unconsciousness. For an instant, he remembered his childhood, the cakes she used to bake, the stories she told, memories he had buried under layers of ambition and selfishness. Now they resurfaced, painful and tender, a reminder of what he had lost, of what he had tried to destroy. Guilt was a poison, but the need to protect her was the antidote. The lion ahead did not look back. It was the personification of relentless justice, but also of unconditional protection. Its steps were silent, but its presence was a thunderclap in Marcos's consciousness. The animal was not just pursuing him, it was guiding him, forcing him to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but the very essence of his humanity. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, but now, with each step, Marcos felt that he was not just fleeing, but walking towards something. The lion was no longer just his pursuer, but also his protector, his judge, and perhaps his guide to a redemption he did not know if he deserved, but which now, more than ever, he desired to achieve. The cold of the fog, the weight of his grandmother, the pain in his muscles, all this mingled with the growing awareness that his life had changed forever. He was in the midst of a judgment, and the sentence was being written with each painful step, with each beat of his guilty and now hopeful heart. The sound of his own footsteps, heavy and dragging, was the only melody in that purgatory. The damp rustle of the fog, the cold wind whistling through the bridge railings, and the frantic beating of his own heart were the only accompaniments. The bridge seemed to stretch infinitely, a grey, damp corridor with no end in sight. But now, Marcos felt a subtle difference. With each meter traveled, with each effort, with each drop of cold sweat that streamed down his face, he felt that he was moving away from the abyss he himself had created. The lion ahead was the personification of his destiny, and Marcos, for the first time in a long time, was willing to follow it, no matter where it led him. The fog, which once seemed a veil for his crime, was now a curtain that hid the uncertain future, but which, paradoxically, propelled him forward, into the unknown, to the chance of a new beginning. The purgatory had no end. The bridge, a grey, damp corridor, stretched out before Marcos like an empty promise of a horizon that never arrived. Each step was agony, a battle fought inch by inch against the exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. His muscles, already in tatters, screamed in protest, every fibre burning as if on fire. Cold sweat streamed down his face, mixing with the dampness of the fog, blinding him momentarily. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't. Donna Elsa, in his arms, seemed to have turned to lead. The faint warmth of her body was the only thing that anchored him to reality, a constant reminder of the life he had tried to extinguish and which now, by a cruel twist of fate, he was forced to protect. Her breathing, a fragile whisper against his chest, was the most precious and terrifying sound he had ever heard. The albino lion, ahead, maintained its pace. Majestic, imposing, it was the silent personification of his destiny. There was no haste in its steps, only an unwavering determination that seemed to mock Marcos's human weakness. The animal didn't look back, but Marcos felt its golden eyes in every fibre of his being, a constant judgment, a relentless vigilance. It was as if the lion knew that Marcos was on the verge of collapse, testing the limits of his endurance, physical and moral. The fog, dense and cold, enveloped everything, transforming the world into a white, oppressive void. The cold wind whistled through the bridge railings, a ghostly lament that seemed to echo the pain in his own muscles and the guilt in his soul. Every metal beam, every crack in the asphalt seemed to bear witness to his forced journey, his personal Calvary. Marcos stumbled. His knees gave way, and for an instant darkness threatened to swallow him. His heart pounded, not just from the pain, but from the pure terror of dropping Donna Elsa. He clutched her with desperate strength, his arms trembling, his teeth clenched. The panic of seeing her roll into the abyss, of failing in his new and terrible mission, was an electric shock that propelled him. He got back up, gasping, every fibre of his body screaming for surrender. But the image of Donna Elsa, so fragile, so dependent, was a shield against giving up. In that moment of extreme weakness, the lion stopped. Just for an instant, it turned its head slightly, its golden eyes piercing the fog, meeting Marcos's. There was no threat, no compassion, only a depth Marcos couldn't decipher. It was a look that said, "This is your test. Will you succumb or will you fight?" And then, as suddenly as it stopped, the lion resumed its path, as if the brief interlude had never happened. That look, that pause, was the push Marcos needed. The exhaustion was still overwhelming, but something inside him had changed. It was no longer just the fear of the lion, nor the guilt that propelled him. It was a visceral, almost primitive need to protect that life in his arms, a need to prove to himself, to the lion, and to the universe, that he was not just the monster he had been. He was a man, and that man would do the impossible to bring Donna Elsa to safety. The memories of his childhood, of the cornmeal cakes she made, of the stories told by the flickering firelight, resurfaced with painful clarity. He had buried those memories under layers of ambition and selfishness, but now they were like knives, cutting through the shell of his indifference, and at the same time a balm for his wounded soul. He remembered her smile, the way she hugged him, the unconditional love he had so cruelly betrayed. Guilt was a poison, yes, but the need to protect her was the antidote, the only chance for purification. The fog, which once seemed a veil for his crime, was now a curtain that hid the uncertain future, but which, paradoxically, propelled him forward into the unknown, to the chance of a new beginning. And then, through the mist, a new silhouette began to form. It wasn't the end of the bridge, not yet. It was something more, something that seemed to emerge from the white veil itself, a dark, massive structure blocking the path, a new obstacle, a new test. The lion, without hesitation, continued forward as if it knew exactly what awaited them in the veiled darkness. Marcos, with his heart in his throat, clutched Donna Elsa even tighter, preparing for whatever came next. The silhouette, once just a dark blur in the mist, solidified into a colossal, shapeless mass. It wasn't the end of the bridge, nor a mirage from Marcos's exhausted mind. It was a tangle of twisted metal, crumbled concrete, and exposed rebar, a brutal remnant of some previous catastrophe, now an insurmountable obstacle that completely blocked the way. It seemed as if the bridge itself had vomited its entrails, creating an impassable barrier. Marcos's heart sank. This was the end. How could he climb that mountain of debris, with Donna Elsa weighing in his arms, every ounce of his strength already depleted? Despair threatened to swallow him, an abyss deeper than any that could exist beneath the bridge. He had overcome pain, guilt, fear, but this seemed an insurmountable challenge, a cruel mockery of fate. But the albino lion ahead showed no hesitation. Its steps remained firm, and Marcos realized that the animal was not going over the barrier, but through it. There was a crack, a narrow and precarious tunnel, barely visible in the fog, between the concrete slabs and the twisted steel bars. It was a passage that seemed to defy logic, an opening that only a creature so agile and determined could use. The lion squeezed through the gap, its massive body disappearing into the darkness between the rubble with surprising fluidity. Marcos knew he had no choice. Following the lion was his only hope. He pressed Donna Elsa against his chest, feeling the faint warmth of her body, a constant reminder of his precious cargo. Her breathing was still a fragile whisper, and the fragility of the life in his arms propelled him. Approaching the gap, Marcos realized the scale of the challenge. The space was tight, the concrete edges were razor-sharp, and the rusted steel bars threatened to tear his clothes and skin. The ground was uneven, covered with loose stones and slippery debris. One false step, and he could fall, dragging Donna Elsa into the dark abyss or to death among the rubble. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. With a silent scream of determination, he bent down, trying to squeeze his body and Donna Elsa's through the opening. The concrete scraped his back, the metal tore his shirt. He felt a sharp pain in his side, but ignored it. The physical pain was insignificant compared to the terror of failing. Every inch was a battle. He needed to maneuver Donna Elsa, protecting her head, her arms, her fragile body from any impact. She was dead weight, but a weight he could not and would not let go of. With each movement, the fear that she would wake up, confused and terrified, haunted him. But she remained in her induced sleep, oblivious to the imminent danger. The lion on the other side of the gap waited. Its golden eyes, like beacons in the fog, watched Marcos's every move. There was no impatience, only a constant vigilance, a presence that was both threatening and encouraging. It was as if the animal was testing his resilience, his ability to overcome the impossible. Marcos felt cold sweat stream down his face, mixing with the dampness of the fog. His muscles trembled uncontrollably, and exhaustion threatened to bring him down at any moment. But the image of Donna Elsa, so vulnerable, so dependent, was a shield against giving up. He remembered the stories she told, the lullabies, the unconditional love he had so cruelly betrayed. Those memories, once buried under layers of ambition, were now his strength, his purpose. With a last agonizing effort, he managed to drag himself out of the gap, swaying and almost falling. He was on the other side, gasping for breath, his body aching, his shirt torn and stained with blood and dirt. But Donna Elsa was safe in his arms. He clutched her with wild gratitude, feeling the beat of his own heart echo in hers. The lion, without a word, without a roar, resumed its path. Its steps were silent, But its presence was a thunderclap in Marcos's consciousness. The animal was not just pursuing him, it was guiding him, forcing him to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but the very essence of his humanity. The bridge still stretched ahead, a grey, damp corridor with no end in sight. But now, with each step, Marcos felt that he was not just fleeing, but walking towards something. The lion was no longer just his pursuer, but also his protector, his judge, and perhaps his guide to a redemption he did not know if he deserved, but which now, more than ever, he desired to achieve. The cold of the fog, the weight of his grandmother, the pain in his muscles, all this mingled with the growing awareness that his life had changed forever. He was in the midst of a judgment, and the sentence was being written with each painful step, with each beat of his guilty and now hopeful heart. With every fiber of his being, Marcos felt triumph and pain. The air, once rarefied by the struggle, now entered his lungs in desperate gulps, cold and damp. He was on the other side of that tangle of metal and concrete, swaying, his body protesting in every joint. But Donna Elsa was safe in his arms. His torn shirt, his scratched skin, and the blood that ran down his side were insignificant compared to that small miracle. He pressed her against him, feeling the faint warmth of her body, a constant reminder of the precious life he had almost destroyed. It was a wild, almost irrational gratitude that flooded him. The albino lion, ahead, did not wait for him with impatience, nor with a roar of approval. It simply resumed its silent steps, as if the overcome obstacle was just another rung on an infinite ladder. Its golden eyes, however, still turned to Marcos for an instant, a look that seemed to say, "Well done, but the journey continues," and Marcos, with a lump in his throat, followed. That animal was not just pursuing him. It was guiding him, forcing him to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but the very essence of his humanity. The bridge stretched again, a grey, damp corridor with no end in sight. But now, with each heavy, dragging step, Marcos felt that he was not just fleeing, but walking towards something. The lion was no longer just his pursuer, but also his protector, his judge, and perhaps his guide to a redemption he did not know if he deserved, but which now, more than ever, he desired to achieve. The cold of the fog, the weight of his grandmother, the pain in his muscles, all this mingled with the growing awareness that his life had changed forever. He was in the midst of a judgment, and the sentence was being written with each painful step, with each beat of his guilty and now hopeful heart. Marcos looked ahead at the majestic figure moving through the fog and followed. A broken man, but reborn on a journey towards an uncertain destiny. With each step, memories of Donna Elsa, of the cornmeal cakes she made, of the stories told by the flickering firelight, resurfaced with painful clarity. He had buried those memories under layers of ambition and selfishness, but now they were like knives, cutting through the shell of his indifference, and at the same time, a balm for his wounded soul. He remembered her smile, the way she hugged him, the unconditional love he had so cruelly betrayed. Guilt was a poison, yes, but the need to protect her was the antidote, the only chance for purification. The air on the bridge began to change, subtly. The fog, which once enveloped him in a dense, uniform embrace, seemed to stir, as if an invisible current were pulling it away. The cold intensified, but it was no longer just the damp cold of the fog. It was a biting cold that seemed to come from below, from the abyss. Marcos felt a shiver run down his spine, and it wasn't just from the wind. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the white curtain began to unravel. It didn't dissipate completely, but became more translucent, revealing not the end of the bridge, but the terrifying vastness beneath it. The faint, diffuse light of dawn, still hidden by layers of clouds, barely penetrated, but it was enough to reveal the dizzying height. Hundreds of meters below, the dark waters of the river churned in a furious whirlpool, its waves foaming against massive pillars that disappeared into the darkness. It was a mesmerizing and terrifying spectacle, a cruel reminder of the fate he had planned for Dona Elsa. The abyss. Marcos's heart pounded. The sight of the turbulent river, so close, so real, brought back the terror of his plan, the coldness of his intention. He clutched Dona Elsa even tighter, as if he could protect her not only from physical danger, but also from the memory of his own cruelty. That image of the fall, of the impact, haunted him, and he felt a knot of nausea in his stomach. The lion ahead stopped. Its golden eyes did not turn to Marcos, but fixed on some point beyond the edge of the bridge, in the darkness that the fog had not yet completely revealed. Its ears moved, catching something Marcos could not yet hear. The animal's body, once relaxed in its silent march, was now tense, every muscle ready for action. And then Marcos heard. A faint sound at first, almost inaudible over the wind and the frantic beating of his own heart. A low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from far away, but that gained strength with each second. It wasn't the sound of a car, nor the roar of another animal. It was something deeper, more mechanical, but with a strange, almost organic resonance. It sounded like the beating of a gigantic heart, pulsing in the depths of the fog. The lion let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but laden with a primal warning. Its eyes, once focused on the abyss, now turned forward, towards the direction from which the sound came. The fog, which had thinned, began to thicken again ahead, as if it were responding to the sound, or perhaps hiding what produced it. Marcos felt a new kind of fear. Not the fear of the lion, nor the fear of guilt, but the fear of the unknown. What was coming? What did that sound mean? The bridge, which once seemed a solitary purgatory, now seemed to be connecting to something larger, something that was approaching from the depths of the fog. He looked at Dona Elsa, her face serene in her induced sleep, and felt a wave of protection. He didn't know what awaited them, but he knew he wouldn't give up. The lion, his guide and his judge, seemed about to present the next test. The thrumming, once distant and mysterious, now grew into a dull roar, a mechanical sound that seemed to swallow the fog itself. The white wall ahead, dense and impenetrable, was suddenly torn by two blinding orbs. Headlights of a heavy vehicle advancing at an alarming speed, like a hungry predator emerging from its lair. The fog twisted, revealing the colossal silhouette of a truck, a monster of metal and smoke, its front grille looking like a gaping maw. The albino lion, its majestic and unreal figure, did not hesitate. With a fluid and powerful movement, it positioned itself in the center of the lane, a living and imposing barrier. Its muscles tensed, its body arched, every fiber ready for impact, and then it let out a roar. Not a hunting roar, nor one of blind fury, but a primordial sound that ripped through the fog, that shook the air, that vibrated in the bowels of the bridge and in Marcos's chest. It was a sound that contained the fury of nature, the warning of the ancients, the very cry of justice. The bridge trembled. Night birds, which Marcos didn't know existed there, took flight in panic, their shrill cries lost in the echo of that ancestral sound. The truck, advancing at speed, reacted with an infernal screech. Compressed air brakes hissed like furious serpents. Gigantic tires dragged on the wet asphalt, leaving dark tracks in the dampness. The cab swayed violently. The smell of burning rubber and diesel invaded the air, mixing with the cold of the fog. For an instant that seemed an eternity. The truck skidded, death on wheels approaching dangerously. Marcos, with Dona Elsa still in his arms, stumbled backward, instinctively shielding her with his own body. The lion's roar, the sight of the runaway truck, all merged into a paralyzing terror. He felt the impact of the sound, the vibration on the ground, the helplessness before that brute force. But the lion did not move. Its golden eyes, fixed on the headlights, were flames amidst the fog, the very personification of unwavering will. Lie, with a last agonizing drag, the truck stopped. Only a few feet separated the chrome bumper from the lion's chest. The engine still rumbled in a menacing murmur, but the silence that followed the screech of the brakes was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of Marcos's heart. The cab door opened with a metallic creak. A burly man with a stubble beard and a baseball cap stepped down, his eyes wide with disbelief and dread. He saw the lion, white and gigantic, standing there like a marble statue, unreal. And then his eyes moved, sweeping the fog until they found Marcos swaying, dirty with blood and dirt, holding an unconscious elderly woman. The truck's headlight, now stopped, bathed the scene in a raw, unforgiving light. There was no more fog to hide. The abyss of the river, the lion, Marcos and Donna Elsa, everything was exposed, revealed in its most brutal truth. The driver, a veteran of the roads, had never seen anything like it. A giant albino lion in the middle of a deserted bridge, in the middle of the fog, blocking his path. And a man who looked like he had come out of a battle with an elderly woman in his arms. The lion then did something unexpected. Its eyes, which had been fixed on the truck, turned to Marcos. There was no longer the fury of the chase, nor the silent judgment from before. There was an acceptance, a recognition. It was as if the animal were saying, "You have reached your destination. Now, the rest is up to you." With a slow and deliberate movement, the lion moved away from the front of the truck, clearing the way. It did not turn to leave, but stood by the side of the road, watching. A silent guardian, still present, but now allowing humanity to intervene, allowing the real world to collide with the purgatory of the bridge. Marcos felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of relief and dread. He had been guided, pursued, tested to the limit of his existence, and now he was there, exposed, with the weight of his actions and the miracle of Donna Elsa in his arms. The driver, still in shock, stammered, "But what? What happened here?" Marcos looked at the driver, then at Donna Elsa, and finally at the lion, which watched him with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his soul. There was nowhere left to run. There was nowhere left to hide. The purgatory had found its exit, and that exit was the truth. With a choked voice, hoarse from exhaustion and emotion, Marcos began to speak. The words tumbled out, a painful but necessary confession. He told of the ambition, of the cruel plan, of the simulated breakdown, of the abandonment. He told of the lion, of the pursuit, of the gap, of the struggle to save Donna Elsa. He omitted nothing, each word a brick in the reconstruction of his own humanity. The driver, initially skeptical, listened with a mixture of astonishment and compassion. He looked at the elderly woman in Marcos's arms, at the wounded man, and from time to time, at the albino lion, which remained motionless, a silent and imposing witness. The story was insane, but the scene before him was too real to be denied. As Marcos spoke, the fog began to dissipate for good. The sun, still shy, began to paint the horizon with shades of pink and orange, revealing the end of the bridge in the distance. The river, once a dark abyss, now reflected the light of dawn, its waters still turbulent, but visible in their vastness. The lion with the rising sun seemed to merge with the light. Its white fur, once a contrast in the darkness, now shone with an almost ethereal splendor. It was no longer just an animal, but an entity, a spirit of justice and redemption. When Marcos finished his confession, a heavy silence hung in the air. The driver, with a sigh, took off his cap and scratched his head. "My God," he murmured. I, I need to call the police and an ambulance for the lady." Marcos nodded, tears streaming down his face. He was not afraid of prison, not anymore. What he feared was not having the chance to redeem himself. The lion, as if it had heard the decision, gave Marcos one last look, a look that seemed to say, "The journey doesn't end here, but the path has been chosen." Then, with a supernatural elegance, it turned and, without a sound, disappeared into the fog that still clung to the edges of the bridge, like a ghost of the night retreating before the light of day. Marcos watched it go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. The lion had played its part. It had been the catalyst, the guardian, the judge. It had forced Marcos to confront the monster within himself and to find the humanity he thought he had lost. The driver, already on the radio, spoke in a low voice, describing the unbelievable scene. Marcos clutched Donna Elsa to him, feeling the warmth of her body, the beat of her heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would face it. He had been reborn on that bridge, pushed to the limit by an albino lion and the memory of a love he had almost destroyed. The bridge, once a scene of crime and despair, was now the stage for a new beginning. Purgatory had come to an end, and the exit was truth, redemption, and the promise of an unconditional love that he, finally, was ready to honor. The sun was rising, and with it, a new chance.